Welcome back to Sports Betting Truth's Intro to Power Rating series. Today is video number 3, and it's a very important one. In terms of what we're going to learn today, it's not so much going to be new concepts when it comes to analyzing sports in the NFL, but more broad concepts that can be applied not just to analyzing sports with Excel and using it for sports betting purposes, but Excel in general. Two concepts I really want to hammer home, and that's modularity and infinite adaptability. In other words, two concepts that if you put a little bit of extra effort in on the front end, it will pay dividends on the back end. And it'll make more sense as we go along here exactly what I'm talking about. But naturally, after the first two videos where we only used one stat, the natural progression is going to be using multiple stats, and that's what we're going to do with this video today, but this is just the beginning of that, so stay tuned. I do want to point out that the Excel file and the macros that I cover in this video will be available in the description below. Go ahead and check those links out so you can have the exact Excel file and macros I'm going to be working with. So instead of typing out the macros like I did in the first video, I'm just going to go through the macro that I already have written out and just explain them macro by macro, line by line, just so you can follow along in case this is your first video. But I wanted to include the Excel file because there's a lot of tabs in there, and just to have it set up the way it's set up, it would be easier just for me to include the file. So let's get started. Alright, so I call this file the NFL two-factor file because we're going to use two different stats today instead of just one. And the stats are going to be points scored and points allowed. So as with the first two videos, we have the scores tab, which is just the schedule of the 2019 season. But then we have a bunch of tabs down here at the bottom. We have 2 tabs for raws, 4 tabs for adjustments, 3 tabs for league, and then the most important tab of this video, the database tab. So the first macro I'm going to cover is going to be the raw calculate macro, which is very similar to the raw calculate macro in the first two videos. I did make some changes to this though, and one of them was instead of using the sheet number, I use the sheet and then the name and quotations. That way it's easier to follow along because we're going to be cross-referencing all the sheets, so it's just easier to follow all the sheets when we're doing that. But for the most part, things are pretty much the same. We're defining the away and home team variables so we can use them in our lookup functions, and then we're going to do a for loop with the start line being 2, which is this line right here. We're starting at line 2 of the schedule and going all the way down to the bottom, which is 268, but instead of just typing 268 as our end line, we're using a function to calculate what that end line is, which is sheet scores.cells rows.count a.end xlup.row. And then we want to clear 5 different sheets, so that way when we're adding to those sheets, we're starting from 0. So we're clearing the raws tabs and all the league tabs. Because if you don't clear them, then it's going to add on to what was already there, and you're not going to get an accurate calculation. And then we want to define the line to begin printing on the raw sheet. So we're going to start at 1, but that's the output row. But the first time we increment that, it'll go to 2, and that's where it will really start. So that's why we're starting it at 1. And then we're going to do a for loop. For those of you new, a for loop basically goes line by line in the schedule and grabs all the information. So that's what these 5 variables are. So the loca variable is the location, sheet scores.cells start line 1.value. So it's taking the start line, which starts at 2 and increments 1 by 1. So 2 and then 1 column over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's what these 1s, 2, 3, 4, 5 represent. So the away lookup function, same thing as the first two videos. It goes through this tab right here and finds which row the team is on. That's what that function does. So as you can see, here's the function right here. It goes through the raws tab line by line until it finds the team in column 1, and then it returns that row number. But if it doesn't find one, it returns 0. So if it returns 0, which it will at the beginning when it's blank, then the new line that we defined earlier increments by 1, and then we print the team on that line. And then we do the same for the home team. So the next part of the macro appends the away team line and the home team line on the raws sheet. So it adds 1 to the games column, and it adds the points scored to the PF column, and then it adds the points allowed to the PA column. So you can see we have these 3 columns right here, so it goes line by line and appends all those numbers into a master calculation. And then we're going to do the same thing with the league averages tab. So here's this, home, away, and all. And you can go ahead and copy this over. So what it does is it just adds to the home away and then the all line, which is going to happen for all games and not just where the location is a home away game. There are some neutral games in the NFL. And then next start line, it goes through that loop again. And then when that's done, it's going to calculate the per game averages from the raw sheet and put them on the raw's PG sheet. So it loops through this entire sheet right here, and it just adds the per game averages into these two columns right here. Pretty simple. And then we're going to do the same thing on the league sheet for the league per game sheet, but we don't have to loop through because it's a set number of rows, home, away, all, so we can just declare them on their own. And then we take these numbers right here, these are the variables, and then we calculate the per game averages and put them on the league per game tab. And then we're going to do the advantage calculations where we simply go to the league per games tab and subtract these and calculate our league advantages. So pretty simple. That's the raw calculate macro. Again, watch the first video if you want a more in-depth explanation on how that macro works. But I was just recapping how it works in this video because this is part 3 of the series. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the raw calculate macro. There we go. So as you can see, it tabulated everything for every team, total number of points scored and points allowed for the season, as well as the number of games played. So then when we go to the raw per game tab, all it did was take these numbers right here and divide it by that number, and there we go. So the Packers, 23.6 points scored per game, 20.7 points allowed per game. So those are our raw calculations, right? So if you've watched the first 2 videos or any of my videos in general, that doesn't tell the entire story because not every team's raw stats are equal apples to apples. Some teams play tougher schedules than the others, so we need to adjust for that. So that's where the adjustments comes in. So we have 4 different adjustment tabs. We have the ADJ tab, the ADJ PG tab, ADJ final tab, and ADJ analysis tab where we're going to break everything down. So what we can do here is copy this over. So the ADJ analysis tab is just so we can analyze our tabs without messing with them. So we have some of the raw populated right now. So the Packers, for example, ranked 14th in points scored and 12th in points allowed. The top point scoring team, the Ravens. The top defensive team, the Patriots. So will that hold after our adjustments? Well, we'll see. So the ADJ tab is pretty much the same as the raws tab, only with the ADJ, it'll tabulate everything. And then the ADJ PG tab is the same as the raws PG tab, where it simply divides everything by the number of games played. And then the final tab simply appends the ADJ PG tab to the raws PG tab for our final adjustment number. So before I go further and explain the first adjustment macro, I want to go over to our database tab. Now the database tab is the entire point of this video when I talk about modularity and infinite adaptability. So you always want to construct things like this with infinite adaptability in mind. And by that I mean it's really easy to add additional statistics on without having to really change your code and reprogram things. So for this video, we only have 2 stats, points scored and points allowed, but in the future, if we want to add more stats, then we want to set up our system where we can simply just add it on without really having to do much work to incorporate the new stats into our already existing code. It'll make more sense as I explain it. So what we want to do is across all of our tabs, we want everything to be consistent, right? So across the raws tabs, the ADJ tabs, and the league tabs, we want everything to be consistent. So we want column 1 to be the descriptor, we want column 2 to be the games, and then we want columns 3 onwards to be the same stats in every tab. So column 3 in all of our tabs is going to be the PF stat. See how it's on column 3 in every single tab? Same with column 4, it's going to be our PA stat. Every single tab is going to be PA in column 4. And that's on purpose. That way we can reference across the tabs and it to be consistent. You don't really have to account for the differentiation across the tabs. And that's why this file has so many additional tabs, unlike our previous videos. That way everything can be consistent. The modularity concept, and that's by design. So obviously column 2 is going to be the games played, but that's a static column. So really the dynamics start in row 3, which is PF, and then PA column 4. But then we want the opposite stat for adjustment purposes. So obviously the opposite stat of points scored is PA, and the opposite stat of PA is PF. column 3. That way we can reference what we're adjusting it by in our macro. So that's how the database is set up right there. So in the future, if we were going to add more stats, we would just add, let's say, I don't know, just throwing one out there, turnovers forced. That would be column 5. And then turnovers given, I guess, would be column 6. And then, the opposite 6, 5, right? If we were going to add more, sorry. But, that's in a future video. But that's kind of the concept here. We're making it so we can easily tack on more stats in the future without having to reprogram and add to our code. All right, so let's talk about the first adjustment macro, and I call it the adjustment do bridge. And I call it the bridge because it's our bridge from the raw to the adjustment. So in the adjustment do bridge, we're going to do a 4 within a 4, but it starts very similar to the raw calculate in that we're going to loop through the entire schedule, right? So we got to define our away team and home team, we got to define our start line and end line, and it's pretty much the same thing as raw calculate, only we're clearing the ADJ tab instead of the raw tab, but it starts very similar. But here we don't really need to call the scores because that's really only for the raw calculate. So we only need to call the first 3 rows here, the location, away, and home. Still doing the away lookup and the home lookup. But since the raw sheet is already populated, we don't need to check the 0 for the if statement. So we're just going to make sure that the order of teams here is just consistent across all of our tabs as well. And then we're going to add the away team and the games played to their corresponding columns in the ADJ column. So columns 1 and 2 will be filled. And then we have a loop to gather the stats for the both teams. And this is where our modularity concept begins. So we could easily just assign variables to rows 3 and rows 4, right? We could easily do that. But like I said, that's not modular. This is modular. So what we're going to do is we're going to loop through our database and call these variables right here. So we're going to start at row 3 because that's, like I said, where the dynamic portion begins because games is a static. And then we're going to end at the end of the database. Since it's only at row 4, it's going to end at 4. So it's basically just going to loop through these 2 rows. But when we add more stats, it'll loop through everything, right? So it's going to loop through our database. And the first variable we're going to call is the stat call, or the stat column variable. And it is pulling from the loop column 2. So for the stat that we're going to refer to, stat col is our PF stat. This variable is going to store the number 3 because it's in column 3 across all our tabs, right? Column 3, column 3, column 3, right? And then the stat opposite column variable takes the opposite column variable from the loop. So in this case, the opposite of PF is 4, so the opposite column stat. And so this variable right here, the home stat, is going to grab the opposite stat from the raws PG tab for the home team. So home stat is going to grab the home lookup stat op called at value. So in the first iteration, it's the Packers and Bears. This variable is going to grab the Bears opposite stat. So if our stat is the points scored for the Packers, then the opposite stat is the points allowed for the Bears. So it's going to grab 18.6. That's what the home stat is for the first iteration of the loop because it's the opposite stat of the points 4. And then we're going to grab the league average stat from the league PG tab, the all row. So they're both the same, PF and PA, but so we're just going to grab PF 22.85. And then we're going to grab the away advantage for the league advantage tab, which is going to be this right here, minus 0.092. And then we're going to calculate the adjustment. The adjustment is basically the home stat. So in the Bears case, 18.6 minus the league stat, 22.85. That's the first part of the adjustment. So basically the Bears had a better defense on average in terms of points allowed per game than the league average. So this is going to be a negative number, and if the location was away, then we're going to subtract this number from the adjustment, so minus, so it's going to add even more to the adjustment. So then we have our adjustment for the points scored for the Packers, so we can add that onto their corresponding row in here, and they're going to be right here, so we're going to add that number right here. And then we do the same thing again, only for the home team, so everything is opposite from here, right? Instead of a home stat, it's a away stat. So we're still on row 3 of our database, so we're still on the PF part, so only this time the away stat is going to be the Packers RAS PG points allowed per game, so 20.7, and home advantage and the home adjustment, but at the same concept otherwise. And then we're going to add that onto the Bears portion of the adjustment column. And then it goes to the next database line, so then we're going to go to line 4 and going to do the same thing over again. Only this time the opposite column is going to be 3, and our actual column is going to be 4. So we loop through all that and append the ADJ sheet. I know it might sound confusing, but it's a modular concept, so you can just tack on additional stats onto the database without really having to worry about reprogramming that code. So when I run the adjustment do bridge, there we go. So these are totals. These are not averages, these are totals. So the total adjustment for the Dolphins for points for per game was minus 28.8. Their points allowed per game total adjustments were minus 20.8, but we need to calculate these into per game averages, and that's what this tab is for. So we have a macro to do that. It's pretty self-explanatory. It simply goes through this line by line, divides that by that, and appends it into the corresponding columns on this tab. Pretty self-explanatory. However, it's a little bit different in terms of the structure because we want to make it infinitely adaptable, so we're going to reference our database tab again to do these calculations. So we have 2 loops. The first loop is going to loop through the ADJ tab line by line, and then the second loop is going to loop through our database tab starting at line 3. So the first part of this macro, the ADJ PerGame Calculate, is the games call. So we want to know which column the games is in, which is going to be 2, but we have that in our database. And then we're going to loop through the ADJ rows, start line and end line. And then we're going to call our games played, so sheets adj.cells start line games call.value, which we called earlier, which is going to be 2. Then we want to add the team name and games played to the ADJ PJ sheet. So we want to add to columns 1 and 2 the team name and games played respectively. And then we're going to loop through our database, starting at line 3 in our database, starting right here at PF, and ending at the function that calculates what the bottom is. So in this case, it's going to be 4, and then it's going to loop through that. So the first variable is going to be stat grab. So it's going to be sheets adj.cells start line and then database s line. So line 3 dot value. So in this case, 2.3 is minus 4.8, and then we're going to append that to the ADJ PJ tab. Column 3 is going to equal stat grab, the stat we grabbed, divided by games played. Pretty self-explanatory. And so when we run that macro, ADJ PerGame Calculate, there we go. These are the per game averages. So on a per game basis, the Dolphins faced a team whose points allowed per game was minus 1.8 points below the league average. Per game, the Eagles faced offenses that scored an average of minus 1 points per game below the league average. So then we have the ADJ final, and that's what this macro is for. It simply adds these numbers onto these numbers, right? It simply subtracts this number minus this number and puts it here. So for the Packers, it's going to be 23.6 minus 0.3, which is going to equal 23.9 if it was just one round of adjustment, right? That's all the macro does. It's structured pretty much the same thing as the ADJ PerGame Calculate. The very beginning is the same, only the end line is calculating the ADJ PJ tab, grabbing the games played, adding it. Everything is the same so far as the last macro, except here's where things differentiate just a bit. The ADJ stat grab is going to grab the sheets ADJ PJ tab, and the row is going to be the start line, and the column is going to be the database S line, starting at 3, going to 4. The raw stat grab, same thing, only on the raw's PG tab, and then the appendation, sheets ADJ final. We're going to add to the corresponding row, and it's going to be raw stat grab minus ADJ stat grab, not plus, but minus. So when we run that macro, here's what it does, and there we go. So this is the first wave of adjustments right here. So we come to our ADJ analysis tab, everything should be populated. The Packers improved their points scored per game rank by 1, and their points allowed game rank stayed the same, even though there was a change. And then the strength of schedule, which is simply this right here and this right here. The Falcons played the toughest schedule when it came to points scored, Remember, strength of schedule points scored is going to correspond to the PA change and vice versa, while the Dolphins played the stuff of schedule when it came to opposing defenses, which makes sense. They played the Patriots, who had the best defense, I believe, yes, twice. And the Patriots, after the adjustments, didn't really change much. Yes, their defense got worse, went from 14.4 to 15.7, but that was still the best. So that's how our modular concept works. But what if we want to adjust it again? We could write a macro to adjust it again like we did in the first two videos and write a separate macro for each round of adjustments. But what if we wanted to write one macro that will allow us a infinite number of adjustments, or to adjust however many times we want it to without having to write a separate macro for each one? Well, that's what this is for. The adjustment do ADJ macro. It's the same exact thing as the adjustment do bridge macro, only this time instead of it being a bridge from the raw to adjustment, it's calling on what's already in the adjustment final tab. That's the only difference. As I point out right here, the only difference is that adjustment do ADJ pulls stats from the adjustment final tab instead of the raw's PG tab. So the only changes are really found is right here. This row and this row are the only difference. The away stat, instead of pulling from the raw's PG tab, is pulling from the ADJ final tab and doing the adjustment based on that. That's the only difference. So if we run adjustment do ADJ, here's our next round, and then we do adjustment per game calculate and adjustment do final, and here's our second wave of adjustments. Did anything change? Well, here we go. All right, now the Packers, remember they were the same at number 12? Well, now they're number 11. But they're also number 12 in the PF, but now they're number 13. So that's 2 waves of adjustments. But what if we wanted to do 10 waves of adjustments? Well, here we go. That's what the rating cycle command is for. So what this does is it basically allows you to do as many rounds of adjustments as we specify right here. So let's do 10, right? So what it does is it runs all of our commands. It calls the adjustment rounds variable from what we specify. It does raw calculate, then it does adjustment do bridge, then it does ADJ PerGame Calculate and ADJ do final, and then we set our cycle counter as 1, and then we decrease our adjusted rounds -1 since we already did 1 right here. And then we do a for loop while the cycle counter goes through and it does the adjustment calculations one by one as many times as we specify, right? And then it activates the ADJ analysis tab automatically. So let's create a button, insert form controls button on the developer tab, and let's assign it to the rating cycle right here. So let's just edit this and call it cycle. So when we click this button, it's going to do 10 rounds of adjustments. Ready? Go. Okay, so how did things really differentiate 10 rounds of adjustment wise? Well, the Cowboys are a team to look for. They're number 6 and number 9 in the raw, but now they're number 6 and number 14 in the adjusted after 10 rounds. So keep that in mind. Keep the Cowboys and the Patriots in mind. So the Patriots 12-1, the Cowboys 6 and 14. What if we did 20 rounds? The Cowboys still 6 and 14, the Patriots still 12 and 1. Things didn't really change much. So that brings me to my next point, which is diminishing returns. You do get to a point in adjustments where things don't really change much. Ideally, you run as many rounds of adjustments until the numbers stabilize. That's what you're looking for. So really, the sweet spot is really up to you to find, but at least in terms of ranks for the Patriots and Cowboys, things didn't change much from rounds 10 to 20. So let's do this. We just did 20 rounds, so let's calculate these numbers and put them right here. Whoops. And let's do 4 rounds. And then we got these numbers. So how much did the numbers really change? Equals R2 minus G2. Whoops. Things didn't really change much. On average, I mean, it's pretty much, things didn't really change. So like I said, especially with the NFL where teams really play a similar schedule almost, you don't really see much benefit in increasing the number of rounds of adjustments too much. But in sports like college, where the schedules are very, very imbalanced and very, very influential and different, you'll see a lot more benefit in doing more rounds of adjustments. So where do we go from here? In the next video, what I'm going to do is show you how to take these two stats and calculate both projected margin and projected win percentage with them. In our first 2 videos, we had a power rating system for win percentage and then a separate one for margin. But can you use one set of numbers to calculate both? Yes, you can. That's what the next video is for. But before I got to that video, what I wanted to do with this video is set the table going forward and teach you the concepts of modularity and infinite adaptability to make our subsequent videos a lot easier to work with when we're adding on additional stats. Like I said, the concept of infinite adaptability and modularity is not just limited to sports betting and sports analysis in Excel. You can take those two concepts and apply it to everything when it comes to programming and data analysis. It's what I do. Like I said, little extra work on the front end, but it pays dividends on the back end by making your life so much easier. Always have infinite adaptability in mind when you're writing code and structuring things. Anyway, that wraps up this video for the Intro to Power Rating series, Part 3, Infinite Adaptability and Modularity. Like I said, the links to this Excel document and the corresponding macros are in the description below. So go ahead and grab those so you can follow along with the video. And also you can inspect the code and analyze it yourself to see exactly what everything does in case you're a newbie at all of this, especially when it comes to Excel macros and Visual Basic. Again, stay tuned for part 4 where we take these numbers and calculate a two-factor approach, margin and win percentages with just those two stats. Until next time, this is Sports Betting Truth signing off.